Welcome to the latest podcast of Center East Nation. We have a guest with us this evening. We have from SportsNet, Donnovan Bennett. Welcome, Donnovan.
Thank you so much for having me.
How have you been in these crazy times of quarantine? How have you and your family been coping?
It's funny you say that because I feel like at this time when people ask, how have you been or how are you doing? The answers, we're grading on a curve in terms of how we reflect and give the answers back, right? In quarantine times, I'm doing really well relative. My family's healthy.
Yes.
I'm healthy. I'm still employed. Thankfully, still busy. So in that sense, I cannot complain. I've been very, very blessed. But I think we all are, with our everyday challenges and just with 2020 as a whole,
Yes.
It's ebbs and flows, and so I don't think, unless you own a grocery store, I suppose, and then you're doing really well, or you sell PPE, and then you're doing really well. But for the rest of us, I think it ebbs and flows. But I'm doing really well right now, and I'm happy to have this conversation with you.
Excellent. One final question in regards to quarantine. What do you plan on doing once things really begin to ease up? Is there one activity that you've been kind of missing out on that you just wish you could do?
That's a great question. If you asked me this a week ago, I would have said go to the barber. Because I was looking like a hostage for a little bit, doing some live hits at home, online via Skype and whatnot.
Yes.
3 months without any sort of grooming in terms of the hair, and for me the beard as well. It was. Let's just say James Harden can pull it off better than I can, or Joe Thornton can pull it off better than I can. So that would have been it. But now that the restrictions have been relaxed a little bit,
yes.
We're in phase 2 here in Ontario, so that's in play. Although immediately, my barber's appointments were booked for all of July. Other than that, I'm not sure because, and not to evade the question, but here's why. Some of the things I really craved, especially in the summer, right? Going to a festival, going to a concert, going to Carabana,
Yes.
going to a Raptors game or a Leafs game and being in Maple Leaf Square and seeing everyone congregate together, going to a movie. Yeah. Having the communal experience of, going to a movie, getting your popcorn, getting there early, finding your seat, laughing with everyone or being scared with everyone. I'm not really sure what those things are going to look like.
Yes. Whenever
our new normal takes shape, or if some of them are even going to exist.
Yes.
I hope this is not the case, and certainly a vaccine will help things, but are we going to have the same watch parties in the same way? Are we going to have the same amount of confidence to have multiple watch parties across the country when our hockey teams or our international sporting teams are doing well? Is a movie theater the same if you've got social distancing? If you're at a comedy and there's like 1/3 of the people there because everyone is staggered by rows with which they watch the movies?
Yes.
So a lot of that stuff, I'm still, I guess, patiently awaiting what the new normal will be as our economy and as our culture reinvents itself post coronavirus.
No, excellent. And I kind of feel the same. Like there are certain things that I missed. Like you meant, funny enough, I definitely wish I could get myself to a barber. But just some of those other activities, like you don't even think, before we didn't even think about jumping into Maple Leaf Square and watching the Leafs or going to watching the Raptors out with thousands of other people. But now when you really start to think about it, I think we're all going to have at least a doubt as things continue to progress and open up. And that kind of takes us to another major topic for 2020. Since the murder of George Floyd at the hands of law enforcement down in the United States, we've also had some additional important conversations inside and out of sports and society at large in regards to racism and inequality. In your perspective, what will be the impact you foresee coming in the short and long term for society and sports from this event?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, short term, we've already seen it. We've seen people speaking up who haven't in the past. We've seen some strength in numbers in terms of not just people who have been speaking up, but them having the power and the leverage to get some tangible change, right? The NFL players, banding together to put out a video, and immediately the commissioner has to respond to them,
Yes.
not vice versa. That's powerful. That's something that if you would have told me would have happened 2 months ago, I would have thought that's crazy, but it's true. And so, if you would have told me that Sidney Crosby, via his foundation, and Connor McDavid, or within 24 hours of each other, would be putting out statements in regards to systemic racism and police brutality, I would have thought you were trying to play an April Fool's joke on me, because it's just not the culture of the sport of hockey historically, and in those two individuals, it's not their nature. And so we've already seen seismic shifts in a very small time in terms of the way people feel about this. I mean, think about this. Colin Kaepernick, not long ago, not only did he kneel and obviously was blackballed and wasn't able to play anymore for protesting the national anthem and wanting to shed a spotlight on some of the systemic inequalities in regards to race that he was seeing in the United States, but it was very almost taken for granted that he would be criticized about it on TV, not by everyone, but by many people. That other players would be public in regards to them feeling that that wasn't the best course of action. And now, quickly, Drew Brees, a Hall of Fame quarterback, says virtually the same sentiments that he said the entire time, and it's almost as if he was about to be canceled.
Yes.
People were protesting and chanting "F Drew Brees" in New Orleans, where he has been a favorite son. And not only does he do a pivot and change his public stance on it, he goes as far enough to talk down to the president of the United States as to why he should change his stance on it. And then just a week after that, when sports is back in the first real way in North America in terms of the NWSL, virtually every female soccer player in the league is kneeling. And if they weren't kneeling, it was almost as if they were ostracized. Now, I don't know if it should be that drastic where you shame people for not falling in line with what the public sentiment is. I think a public discourse and a sharing of ideas is always important. But just the fact that everything was flipped 180 degrees that quickly lets you know that the seas of change are kind of are arisen, and people certainly feel two things. One, they feel many different about the issue, but two, they certainly feel different about their ability to speak on the issue. And so what that means long term, I'm not sure yet. I do know that brands are paying attention, right? And we are in this time frame where you can no longer sit on the fence. You can no longer be a bystander. If you're a league, if you are an organization, if you are an owner or executive, if you are a player, if you are an advertiser or sponsor,
Yes.
people are asking you, where do you stand on these issues? And then asking you to show your work in terms of what are you doing to back up your stance. And so long term, when that is the case year after year, fiscal after fiscal, quarter after quarter, I think you start to see more resources being put towards these causes. And that's how you have real actionable change. But we're still a little ways from that yet.
No, most definitely, and that actually, kind of takes us to an interview we did. I want to say about a month ago with ex Maple Leaf Mark Frazier, where he discussed, where hockey could be going or will be going in the future, as well as, his experience with racism and difficulties he faced on his journey to the NHL. Did you encounter anything similar as you embarked on your career in sports media?
I mean, I would never compare my story and ascension with Mark's. He literally is a trailblazer, and he literally was alone in that quest.
Yes.
That hasn't been the case for me in the same way in regards to hockey specifically, because our social discourse is so toxic that whenever I have a piece of work that is loosely related to race, I will see racially charged tweets, if not outright racist tweets. I did a piece a couple years ago about 5 free agent quarterbacks that the Buffalo Bills could potentially sign, right?
Yes.
One of them being Colin Kaepernick. And I did not mention his protest, his stances. I had written about the topic, but in this piece, it was strictly about football and availability of players and who might fit. And the only real tie in that piece to his, public protests was the fact that, unlike, another market that had a quarterback vacancy, if you will, at the time in the New York Jets, unlike New York, where it's a huge, huge media market, might be a little bit easier for him to assimilate back into football life. In Buffalo, where the media is a little bit friendly and there are less people on the beat. That was really, literally the only mention of Colin Kaepernick in relation to his protest. Everything else was him as a football player.
Yes.
And there were so many messages about what it meant in terms of the flag and that I was race baiting and playing the race card. It was as if nobody read the article whatsoever. They just saw I wrote it and they saw that Colin Kaepernick was in it. So certainly I've seen a lot via social media,
Yes.
via race. But that's not unique to me. It's somewhat, I guess, par for the course now for people of color in the industry.
Yes.
In terms of hockey specifically, I've had a bit of a dual perspective in terms of some of the responses I've gotten in covering hockey, which I wouldn't pretend to say that I cover hockey. I'm a beat writer. I'm not, talking about what the Leafs should be doing on their power play. I'm not getting as upset or excited about any win or loss as my good friend Steve Dangle is. I'm not, giving you information about why Toronto may or may not be a hub city like my good friend Elliot Friedman.
Yeah.
But I cover hockey in the sense of I'm a storyteller and I'm loyal to the best stories.
Yeah.
And I will look for human interest stories, and often, especially in this country, they end up being in the sport of hockey. My piece with Austin Matthews and his mother about their Latin descent being a somewhat recent example. And so I've seen and heard when I've covered hockey in terms of the pushback. It's twofold. One, you don't like hockey anyways. Why do you care about hockey? You're just doing your boss's bidding as a diversity person covering hockey. Stick to basketball, right? So that's the one side of it. The flip side of it is, why are you covering hockey? You don't like hockey anyways. You're just doing your boss's bidding. In terms of covering hockey, hockey isn't a black sport. You're trying to acquiesce and be white and cover a white sport. That second side of the feedback was actually from black people. I've gotten pushback from black people about the fact that I'm covering hockey just as much as I've gotten pushback from white people in terms of me and my loose covering of hockey over the years. So it is neither side deters me.
Yes.
Both disappoint me, but for different reasons.
Yes.
But yeah, the treatment that I've had to endure is minuscule in comparison to what someone like Mark Fraser has had to endure, and to be quite frank, what the current black players still have to endure.
Yes.
And I think more than anything, that's the most disappointing thing, is that you had a Willie O'Ree, you had a Mark Fraser. They put up with a lot and continue to push forward, not just for themselves, but to open up opportunities for others. And now that we are starting to benefit from the riches of what those guys have done, and we've got more players kind of standing on the shoulders of those giants, they're still dealing with some of the same
Yes.
things. As you know, even recently, you know, being drafted and your entry into the league on a call not dissimilar to this, on a web app, trying to just meet your new fan base, and that was bombed with racial epithets. So I'm hoping, when you have Quentin Byfield on your podcast at some point in his career, I'm hoping that his lived experience is much different than Mark Fraser's is. But I'm not confident at this moment that would be the case. But hopefully this greater conversation that we're having makes sure that is the case.
No, and that's so true. And you know what, you kind of start to see the game continue to pivot, and I've even began to follow your career a lot because I love your work, and I what really brought my attention was that one piece that you did with Austin and his mom, and his upbringing as a part Mexican player coming up in the NHL, and that actually brought, when I was thinking about that mother-son relationship, that got me thinking about a recent article that you wrote a couple weeks ago, a very emotional and personal piece entitled "A Movement, Not Just a Moment: Thoughts for My Son on Racism in Sport." And you dedicated that piece to your son. For those that haven't read it yet, can you share with our listeners, what that article entailed, and maybe even some of the feelings and emotions that article, as you were writing, brought out in you?
Yeah, sure. So, full disclosure, and that wasn't even my idea. Paul Sadu, who's an award-winning feature producer, was tasked with coming up with a video essay for a racism special that we had here at Rogers Sports and Media that aired on City and on SportsNet, called "Ending Racism: What Will It Take?" And so there's a block in that show that was dedicated to sports. We talked to Donnovan Bennett, we talked to Hakeem Alou, obviously,
Yes.
and that essay kind of set the tone for it. And we knew we were going to do a video essay, and we just didn't want to do a chronological look at sports and how they tie to race. And then we're going to talk about Jesse Owens, and then we're going to talk about Jackie Robinson, and we're going to talk about Willie O'Ree, on and on and on. We didn't think we could do any of those individual moments justice in the allotted time. But how could we, give nod to them, but also speak to the power of sport and the power and opportunity that sport has to change hearts and minds via race. And so it was his idea to approach it as a letter to my son. So that letter literally became a video essay, but it became an article on our website where I took the copy of the letter and made it an article. And I mean, we've heard a lot in these last, I was going to say days, but it's weeks now. It's really a month since George Floyd died on Memorial Day. We've heard a lot of talk about the talk that black parents have with their sons and often with their daughters about what life has in store for them, how in many ways their life is going to be more difficult because of racism, and specifically how interactions with the police could go and should go as a forewarning. And my son is now 14 months. I'm far from having the talk with him or anything close to it, but I do also know that everything that's good in my life has come from sport. And attacking that letter, as I'm thinking more and more about his life and what I want it to be and what our country to be, as he lives his life here. When I see scenes of George Floyd and watch the video, when I see and hear the testimony about Defonte Miller here in Canada, I think of my son in both those instances. I don't really think of myself anymore. So that was the genesis of writing a letter to him for this piece. Because that experience and that feeling that I have is not one that's unique to me, even though my son was in the video and I was using references about our family and my life. There are many people who have that lived experience, and so hopefully I was able to express to those people who are having the same thoughts, worries, concerns that I have for their children, that those thoughts, worries, concerns are seen and they're valid, and hopefully I was able to express to people who don't thankfully have those same thoughts, worries, and concerns for their children, empathetically, that this is kind of what it's like, and maybe I could communicate that way. So that was the goal of the piece, and they were my words and my voice, but there was a small but mighty team of, as I said, Paul Sadu, producer, and Adrian Chetty, and Vince as the editor, who really put it together. They were, they were the grinders for that piece. They did all the dirty work, and then I just came off the bench and got like a power play goal. So it's a piece of work I'm really proud of, and hopefully it stands the test of time.
No, most definitely, and I really enjoyed it, and I went back and reread it before our interview today, and it does really make you think. Like, obviously, I'm a white person, and to kind of get some perspective on someone else's life and what someone else is going through, and some of the struggles. Like, my parents will never have had to have that talk with me about what my interactions with law enforcement might look like, or how society might look at me. So it kind of allowed me to not necessarily walk in someone else's shoes, but at least walk beside them, and understand and empathize with, what people are going through during a very difficult time, right now, and even, moving into hopefully we can begin to bring about more change as we go forward. And you touched on it very quickly about, some of the current NHL players and how the game is starting to shift for them. Just recently, players like San Jose Sharks forward Evander Kane and former NHLer Akeem Aliu and others announced the creation of the Hockey Diversity Alliance. What do you think the impact of this alliance will be on the game of hockey as it continues to evolve moving forward?
I think we've already seen it with the uninterrupted, video that they've done. Their ability to communicate with each other and be so honest and support each other and relate to each other. It's great for them. It's really great for young black players coming up, looking up to them and looking towards them, and almost having a guidebook, if you will, on how to assimilate and comport themselves as they try and break into the league. We were talking a lot about privilege right now. It is a privilege for a white Canadian American hockey player to just go out and compete and think about their role on their team and performing, and not have to think about all of that stuff. But for years, international hockey players, black hockey players, had to think about how they were being perceived, how they carry themselves, just to fit in into the culture in order to survive. And so for the young black players coming up, it almost acts as a North Star of, these are guys who have seen it and done it and are still doing it. And I can take solace in that, but I also can go to them as a reference. And I think, again, when you know better, you do better. I'm sure a lot of those guys have teammates, have coaches, have executives, have agents who had no idea the types of things they were going through, the types of things they thought about, that were worried about, that made them uncomfortable. And now that that is out there, they can start to be cognizant of it. They can start to change their behavior, and this is off of one video.
Yes.
And so certainly when you look at all those guys being well connected in the game, having a vested interest in the grassroots, hopefully that impact it seeps down to all levels of the game. And this is, and I think this point is important to underscore. This is work that they all have been doing for a while. Yeah. Wayne Simmons has had his road hockey tournaments for a while. Joel Ward has been going into communities in every city that he plays in for a while. Evander Kane has been speaking truth to power for a while. Now they're doing it collectively. They're strategizing, they're mobilizing, and hopefully, with that greater volume, they're each individually able to have more impact on their own initiatives because they have a group mindset. So yeah, I'm proud of those guys. I'm inspired by those guys, and I'm cheering those guys on, no question.
Excellent. And I just want to do a slight shift from the sport of hockey to now your industry. And funny enough, you brought that how these players were inspiring you. I want to ask you, as one of the more higher profile black sports media personalities here in Canada, what do you feel your role is in encouraging other black and minority youth looking to get into sports media? And currently, is their path more difficult, or is the path more difficult for visible minorities who want to get into sports media?
Yeah, good question. So, I'm a firm believer of making your mess your message. And so, if you have, an issue or something that you're struggling with, or something that's held you back, embrace it. Attack that hurdle. Find a way that you can really influence with whatever that pain is, so that you can have some real impact. I remember interviewing Doug Whaley, the GM of the Buffalo Bills, former GM of the Buffalo Bills, who was one of the only black GMs in the NFL at the time. And he said something to me that really stuck with me. He said, everyone should have a mentor and be a mentor. And it's really, really true. You have to have people that you can look to and pick their brain and confide in, whatever the topic, right? Your work, your family life, your ability to impact your community as a citizen. But in the very same way, you have to look to others who could use some mentorship and not have a crabs in the bucket mentality, but look to bring other people with you, right? If you were riding that elevator up, you have to send it back down for more people to be afforded the same opportunities that you were given. And so for me, I think it's not something that I necessarily set out to do at the beginning of my career, but it has in one way become my calling, that I can speak to these issues, that I can hopefully impact change within my industry, and for me that starts within my organization. So I do take the role of mentor very seriously. I do think it is not a burden, but an opportunity and a privilege to try and change and shape the experience for minorities in our business, by using some of my access to powerful individuals within the industry to try and make them aware of some of the challenges and see if we can find solutions. And that's work that I'm doing right now. So it is tiring, but it gives me energy knowing that there's many things that are just very easy fixes that would make I think it easier for the industry to become more diverse, but I think it would make the industry better. It would make the coverage of sports better. It would make the profit margins of many of the sports media businesses better, and it certainly would make the viewing experience for a fan better. And so that's kind of what I'm fixated on right now and moving forward. And so whether it's with my storytelling or even things that I'm trying to get done behind the scenes, it is a focus of mine. I did have some struggles and some challenges in terms of an ascension in the business, based on race. I kind of describe it as you're being haunted by this ghost, because you never really know how much race is playing a factor in your interactions and decisions that are made, about your career. You don't have like an open and shut case to show race played a factor and here's how or why. And there's no actuarial scientist that's going to give me some formula that says, oh, yeah, in this scenario, race played 27.2% of a factor, right? That's just never going to happen, and you never know. So, in a way, I try not to fixate on it because it could take over your mental capacity if you do, and the job is tough enough just focusing mentally. So I have freed myself from it, but I have not been oblivious to it. I know and I understand that we have years and years, hundreds of years of data that tells us that race plays a factor in the workforce. And so if that's the case, it's far be it from me to believe that that's not the case in sports media, which is historically an old boys club. Yeah. So I know it's a factor. I don't let it break my spirit. I just kind of use it as fuel to see if and how I can change it. And if that is my, I don't want to say legacy because I'm not. It's not like I'm retiring anytime soon. But if that's one of the ways that I can contribute to my industry and my organization, I'll be very happy with that.
No, and that's excellent. And that actually leads me to another question. Was there ever a time, maybe not necessarily with SportsNet currently, but just as you were coming up through the ranks, was there ever a time that you were asked to maybe tone down what you were writing or water down a particular opinion piece? And how did you overcome that moment?
That's a good question. I don't think I was asked to tone down or water down what I was writing. Like there are some logistical things. Like, so for example, I wrote that George Floyd was murdered because that's what I believe. I mean, that's what I saw. And I was told I couldn't use the word murdered because he technically has not been tried for murder, and that legally I can't say that. So I mean, there may be like some procedural things like that. Yes. Overall, no one's like, hey, how about you pump the brakes on race for this month? How about you take this week off? No one has said anything like that. But I will say that over time, there's a fatigue certainly in pitching those stories because you don't want to come off as like the angry black guy that wants to talk about race all the time. Like, it's not like I'm walking into the office, wearing a Black Panther t-shirt saying I need to write a story about injustice. In fact, most people, myself included, got into sports because they want to talk about fun things and things that they like and they're excited about. And so maybe it's self-imposed. I don't know how much maybe it was perceived, but there is some, over time, a trepidation in terms of, all right, I've pitched 6 Colin Kaepernick stories. Am I going to pitch 7th? Do I want to be the Colin Kaepernick guy? And so, again, I don't know how much of that is just perceived in that it wouldn't be received as well or wouldn't be as interested, or there might be a little bit more pushback in terms of me proving as to why it is a story, which in itself is fatiguing, having to litigate the worthiness of a story before you actually write it. I do think in between 2016 when Colin Kaepernick kneeled and now, I did feel that I don't know how many of these I'm going to pitch. I don't know how well they'll be received, or they might be received, but they'll be through the gritting of teeth. I don't feel that right now in this moment. I actually feel the opposite. I feel like there's a desire to have these conversations, to do this storytelling, and in fact, I'm actually trying to be a little bit more judicious in a way of balancing. People care right now. There's certainly eyeballs who are paying attention in this important conversation, and I want to strike while the iron is hot. However, I also don't want to be the boy who cried wolf, and maybe write a story that is not as strong or that I'm not as passionate about just because this is the topic of the day. I'm trying to find where that balance is.
Yes.
So that I think is my current challenge.
And that actually kind of really plays into our final question for the interview. With all the major sports set to return soon, do you think that there's a fear that with all the sports coming back that they might begin to overshadow the current conversations that we're having around race and racism? Or will you foresee these games becoming a vehicle for healing and positivity?
I don't want to skirt the question, but I think both can be true. Because there's one thing that is a fact. If sports had been going on throughout this period, a bunch of people would not be spending as much time on Zooms just like this, or on Skypes just like this, talking to friends, or spending time reflecting by themselves, thinking about these issues. We would just get distracted by life. We would get busy with other things. And so I do think part of the reason why this is different is because the culture that we are currently living in is different.
Yes.
And a lot of people, when I write about this stuff, I'll see, hey, stick to sports. Sports is supposed to be a distraction from life's problems. Well, maybe we don't need a distraction. Maybe, in fact, that's the problem.
Yeah.
Maybe we need a little bit more focus. And in fact, if you think I'm going to be your distraction when there are serious issues going on in the world, then that's a problem, because I don't want to be anyone's court jester. I want, hopefully, to lead us to water so that we're all, enriched from thinking and talking about these things. So certainly I do think sports coming back and the news cycle having more things to focus on takes us away from focusing on this critical issue. But I do think sports and athletes specifically have an opportunity with the eyeballs that come with the huge ratings and the coverage and the interest in sports. And so imagine if who's a good imagine if unfortunately a lot of the black players are not going to be playing in the playoffs. But imagine if it actually maybe would be impactful if it wasn't a black player. But imagine if Naz Kadri or even Steven Stamkos. I was trying to think of someone who has a big enough platform.
Yes.
Imagine if after they scored, they put up a fist in salute with Black Power. Or imagine if after a game, when the media said, hey, I want to talk to you about that game winner, they said, sure, but first I want to address the missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada right now, and that we need to do something about it. Imagine what influence that would have, what conversations that would start. Imagine if whoever wins, the Stanley Cup, and they bring it home to Canadian soil for the first time. Imagine if at the parade, instead of a championship T-shirt, made by Adidas, one of the players, or even a coach or executive, wore a shirt that said "Trans Lives Matter." Right? Well, imagine how much that would do for that community, knowing, hey, you're seen in this really important moment. I'm speaking directly to you, even with a small gesture of wearing a T-shirt. So I do think, even though sports at its best distracts us from life's ills, it's one of the reasons why we love it, to be honest.
Yes.
I do think that the players, the teams, the leagues, and organizations can use it thoughtfully and critically to add attention to things that are really important to them.
No, excellent. Well, thanks again, Donnovan, for your time this evening. Do you mind sharing with our listeners where they might be able to find you on social media, and possibly share any upcoming projects that you might be working on where they can offer their support?
Yeah, 100%. So at Donnovan Bennett, DonnovanBennett on Twitter and on Instagram, and on Facebook. But only people our age uses Facebook. So many of your young listeners have no idea what the Book of Faces is. I apologize, I'm not on TikTok. Nobody needs to see that. But yeah, that's where you can find me on social. In terms of stuff that I have coming out, I recently had that dropped the morning of Canada Day, a piece about our country and how proud of it we are and how much we celebrate it. But maybe if Canada was just as intentional, similar to what I was just saying about using sport for good, for all people. That would be something we could be really proud of. Example I'd use would be Humboldt, right? We rallied as a nation. People died in a catastrophe, and the entire country felt for the community of Humboldt, for the entire province, and we raised millions quickly. It's the second highest fundraiser on the history of the platform, highest in Canada. Imagine if we did that for some other causes. Imagine if we did that for communities that are underserved and over policed. Imagine if we did that for our friends, in First Nations communities that don't have any running water.
Yeah.
Like they are living in a third world country in a first class country. So that's the essay that's coming out, or that came out, I should say, by the time people are listening to this on Canada Day. And I have a long form article that I wrote about being a journalist in Canada that's black, and some of the pitfalls and some of the struggles and the way you're pigeonholed and framed, and maybe more diversity in sports media might be a way to break that down. That piece will be on sportsnet.ca.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Donovan, for your time. We definitely appreciate it.
No problem, anytime.